Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about a terrifying nightmare on divorce and remarriage. Don't go anywhere. One night I experienced a horrifying dream that I believed was God through my unconscious, trying to wake me up to the false doctrine I had long believed and taught in churches of Christ. I had always held the view that those who were in their second marriage, or third, or fourth, were still bound to their first spouse in God's eyes. This is what I had been taught growing up and what I had learned in preaching school, and I believed this way for years. But in the dream, which was actually a nightmare, I discovered that my wife was not my first wife because I had been previously married before, and through some kind of amnesia, I was unaware of it. Of course, it was a very disturbing dream to me because I've only been married once. But some mistake in my past, unknown to me, but now made known, showed that my marriage was invalid in the eyes of God. We were suddenly adulterers in His sight, and we had to dissolve our marriage and split up our family because of it. Both of us were required then, according to the doctrine that I believed and taught, to live the rest of our lives alone and celibate. According to my beliefs at that time, I had to leave her in order to be consistent with what I believed and secure my eternal salvation in heaven. In the dream, I was realizing that my life was destroyed. My hopes and aspirations were dashed in an instant. Not only my wife, but my children were being affected. They were being taken away from me. My household was split. My career, my ministry, all of my efforts were ruined because I was now the hypocrite who preached against doing something that I myself was in violation of doing. I panicked. The godly home that I had prayed for and worked so hard to build was destroyed, and it was no fault of my own. I didn't know. I had an amnesia. I was unaware of a previous marriage. But nevertheless, my present marriage had to come to an end. This nightmare revealed to me the psychological horror of the false doctrine that I was preaching. It was a doctrine that attacked people in their most vulnerable place, in their own homes and in their own hearts. And it viciously seeks to break apart what God has joined together. It delegitimizes a beautiful union created by God Himself. And it falsely labels something sacred and pure as something that is wicked and defiled. It was only after this dream that I started to realize that preaching this doctrine is a form of spiritual abuse, and breaking families apart is one of the most horrifying and evil things that someone could do. To inflict this much stress and anxiety and emotional trauma and terror on the souls of people who just want to serve God in peace is reprehensible to me now. I can't imagine myself teaching anything like this again. Now, I did not realize how abusive it was while I was ignorantly telling people what I had been telling them, that they were living in adultery and that they were sinning against God because they were in a second marriage. I did not understand the pain that it must have been causing them. And for whatever reason, before I had that dream, I could not see it from their perspective. I didn't think about it. But then I finally came to an understanding of just how destructive this heresy really is after the disturbing nightmare took place. Of course, there were things said that made me question the doctrine before this, but I was not shaken out of my complacency until God allowed this dream to wake me up to the vileness of the doctrine. So afterwards, I tried to put myself in the shoes of people who were hearing what I was saying to them, and I tried to empathize with them and imagine how it must have felt to them to hear their marriages being condemned, hearing that their relationship should be destroyed. I could then finally understand that it resulted in a lot of pain, sadness, frustration, anger, and all kinds of negative feelings back then. And the tragedy is, there's no need for any of it, because we have complete forgiveness in Christ. If you believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, which if you're a Christian, I know you do, you know that He has forgiven you of all sins, all your trespasses, not just some of them. Divorce is not the unforgivable sin. And so by telling people you need to get out of your marriage, what we are saying to them is fruitless, and it's a waste of time and energy, and it's also destructive. We have no reason to suffer anxiety over our marriages. None of us do. And how do I know that? Because every single marriage is holy in the eyes of God. That is what I want to communicate to you today. All marriage is acceptable and sacred to God. And I want to spend just a few minutes now proving what I have said from the scriptures. The book of Hebrews chapter 13 verse 4 says, marriage is honorable among all, not just some, all, and the bed undefiled. The fornicators and adulterers God will judge. This verse underscores that marriage is honorable for all people without exception. And that contradicts the notion that some marriages are dishonorable or some marriages need to be dissolved because of a previous marriage somewhere in the past. Those who say that people who are remarried are not actually in another marriage are making up nonsense. This is the false doctrine. And that may sound a little harsh to call it a false doctrine and a heresy, but that's what it is. I have no desire to come across as harsh to you. I don't want to say something that hurts your feelings. But let me tell you, these preachers and teachers who are saying this are very confused. Jesus told the Samaritan woman in John 4 that she didn't have just one husband, but 5 husbands. He acknowledged the reality of divorce. He acknowledged that divorces happen and that remarriage happens. And someone can be, in fact, divorced and remarried. He didn't state that it was impossible. He acknowledged the possibility of it. And it's a reality of life. It happens. Sadly, it shouldn't happen. We don't want divorce to happen. God hates divorce. But it does happen. Did you know that God has personally divorced Israel? We see this in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 8. The northern 10 tribes, the nation of Israel, was divorced by him because of their spiritual adulteries. And God himself uses this analogy of divorce to describe his relationship with Israel, demonstrating that divorce is not, in and of itself, inherently sinful. Think about it. God is not going to condemn what he himself does. Is he doing wrong when he took a bride, the church? When he took a holy, pure bride for himself, was he sinning? No. Why? Because he is no longer bound to faithless Israel. And therefore, you're not bound to your first spouse either. It's as simple as that. And while we're talking about the right to remarriage, I want to address the claims that many make about Ezra chapters 9 and 10. God commanded the people through the prophet Ezra to put away their pagan wives. He said, you can't be married to them anymore. They took wives that they had no right to have, and they had to separate themselves from them in order to be right with God again. And people who hold the traditional view often bring this up as a supposed precedent to support their claim that remarriage after divorce is not allowed, and that you have to put away the second spouse that you had no right to have. But there's several problems with that. First of all, these people did something specifically opposed to what God commanded. He said, don't take pagan foreign wives. God never said in the Old Testament or any other time, don't marry after divorce. Now, they claim that's what Jesus taught in Matthew 19:9 and Luke 16 and Mark 10. But upon closer examination, that just isn't the case. Jesus never said that. No prophet of God ever said that. Secondly, once these men put away the pagan wives, they were free to marry again. They could find a wife of their choosing. These Israelite men who had done wrong at one time could marry another Israelite woman after putting the pagan wife away. So to claim that this is an example of divorce and remarriage being unauthorized for Christians is simply not the case. So thirdly, the events here in Ezra 10 contradict the traditionalists' entire claim about the nature of divorce and remarriage. They are saying that you have to end your marriage because it isn't really a marriage to begin with. You're just fornicating with someone after bailing on your first wife. But that isn't at all what is going on in Ezra 10. God calls them marriages here. He acknowledges that they are indeed married. But he says that they, not us, need to end the marriages that they were in by putting away the foreigner. So the traditional view, the covenant marriage view, says you don't have a second spouse because you're still bound to the first. Totally different, isn't it? It doesn't fit. They have a similar problem with their argument about John the Baptist and Herod. John condemned King Herod for having his brother's wife. It had nothing to do with ending an illegitimate marriage. It's not because he was bound to his first wife. It was about ending his actual marriage, since it was not lawful to exist in the first place, since it was with his brother's wife, which was illegal under the law of Moses. So the traditional view is a completely different concept in what they're saying. They're claiming that the second marriage is adulterous because it isn't really a marriage at all. It's a phantom marriage. It's a faux marriage, a pretend marriage, because the first one is somehow still in force. So using Ezra or John the Baptist to make a case for delegitimizing marriages just doesn't work. I want to spend a few moments talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15, which is often called the Pauline exception or the Pauline privilege. It says, "But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace." This passage indicates clearly that if an unbelieving spouse leaves, the believer is not bound, highlighting that marital bonds can indeed be dissolved. And at least this one circumstance, and there are others as well. Jesus mentions one in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, where it can be dissolved because of fornication. But here, by departure, simply by departure of the unbelieving spouse, one is then free to remarry. There's another passage that's commonly cited by those who take the traditional view, and that's from Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, where Jesus says, "But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery." While this passage is often cited to support the traditional view, it also provides us with an exception clause. And that acknowledges that there are circumstances under which divorce and remarriage do not constitute adultery and do not cause someone to commit adultery. First of all, this is in the reflexive case, meaning no one is being caused to do anything. They are simply being sinned against and adulterated by the act of the sinning spouse. So that should be clarified as well. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, this passage provides regulations for divorce and remarriage in the Old Testament. And it indicates that remarriage was permitted under certain conditions, contrary to the idea that it is always wrong. I know we're not under the law of Moses anymore. Nevertheless, the passage shows us that God has not been, throughout history, so strict on people. And supposedly the law of Christ is the perfect law of liberty. How is it that we're under a law that's more strict, that's more difficult to obey than the law of Moses? Does that make a lot of sense to you? But this passage here in Deuteronomy should help us to formulate our understanding of Matthew 19, because Jesus is commenting on this law when he answers the Pharisees' question on divorce. It's also important to know what Deuteronomy 24 teaches before we approach Romans 7. Romans chapter 7, verses 2 and 3 say, "For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she is released from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband lives she marries another man, she will be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she has married another man." This passage speaks to the binding nature of marriage while both spouses are alive, yet it also acknowledges freedom upon the death of a spouse. People with the traditional view tend to quote this verse, thinking that it helps their case, but either they forget or they don't realize that Paul is talking about how it was under the law of Moses. It was a very lenient system in those days. And a woman would be freed to remarry not only by the death of her husband, but by him ceasing to be her husband after putting her away. With a certificate of divorce, remarriage to another man was allowed, and it's certainly allowed today under the age of grace. So as we wrap this up today, I want to say that the doctrine which teaches that those who are in a second marriage are still bound to their first spouse in God's eyes is not only false, it's also destructive. I was warned in a dream, but I had these things taught to me and shown to me in the Word of God even years before that. And I didn't recognize and understand that it undermines the assurance of godly people to believe this way. It breaks families apart when we believe this way. And it contradicts the biblical teaching that marriage is honorable among all. The dream that I had, thank God, alerted me to the terrors and destructiveness of this false doctrine on divorce. And as we have seen through various scriptures, remarriage is not inherently sinful. And the bonds of marriage can indeed be dissolved, either sinfully or as a concession. But the point is, they can be dissolved. Let us not stand in judgment of those who have been divorced and remarried. God doesn't. He's forgiven us all our trespasses. I want to thank you so much for watching this video. And if there is any way that I can help you, you can contact me. My email address is in the description below. And if you want counseling, I'm certainly offering that. I'm taking clients at this time, so you can reach me for that as well at the email provided. If you want to share any thoughts that you might have on divorce and remarriage, I'd be glad to see those in the comments below. Thank you so much again. God bless you. Have a great day.